So what I'm going to chat to you about is really the patient experience, and I'm trying to bring in and to round out our beautiful speakers kind of the experience that we hear from the young women that we work with or engage with. So I guess a bit of background on the Australian Endometriosis Foundation is that we exist to improve the lives of young people living with endometriosis across Australia. So we work to educate, to advocate and to support through community these young women, and the age range that we focus on is 18 to 35-year-olds, and we do this across Australia. So it's a network which has quite a thriving and engaged community online. We have quite a big following and kind of engagement through social media, and then we also host in-person events with the idea that while we aren't in the medical field and our business is not, medical advice by any means, we do see the power of bringing young people together so that they can share their experiences and really connect with one another and learn through that peer exchange. So we're an enabler, we're a convener of that to allow women who might not otherwise have kind of a community of people going through what they're going through, we provide that. So a core part of what we do and what really does guide our work is being informed by those with lived experience. So we have really over time built the skill of listening, of deep listening, and really ensuring that we're kind of getting a pulse check from our members. We have over 2,000 members across Australia, and we use occasions like this to ask the community, what are your thoughts on acupuncture? So when Millie, our founder, was first invited to this occasion, she thought, I'm gonna ask the community, how do they feel? So I'm gonna share some of those insights, and I acknowledged to Nora before that I beg you to please not, don't jump to please to any kind of major conclusions about what I'll share. I'm simply kind of feeding back to you what we heard from those women in our community, but this isn't a rigorous study. This is like a little snapshot just to bring you kind of to the face and the patient side of things. So we designed this survey not to determine whether acupuncture works or to kind of get into the science at all behind it, but rather to understand what happens when young people try it, and those with endometriosis specifically. So we were really curious about, what motivates them to try acupuncture, what might stop them, what's in the way of them trying it, how long do they commit, and we talked a bit earlier about how that's really a critical part around the success of acupuncture or lack thereof. And what changes for them? What are their experiences? I'm going to share a few quotes. I'm trying to kind of get us to, be specific as possible about what an individual experiences when they're going through this. So we had 300 respondents, and those were aged, as mentioned, between 18 and 30 years old, and they're all diagnosed with endometriosis. Many have lived with symptoms for years and have tried multiple conventional Western and Eastern treatments. Some were looking for alternatives, others were looking for something to complement their clinical care. So we asked about how young people perceive acupuncture. The first thing we explored was, whether it was worth trying, what their perceptions were, and I'm just going to share some of the results. Bear with me because I'm going to just call out a few stats. 48% of those that we surveyed viewed acupuncture as worth trying, not necessarily because they believed in it wholeheartedly, but they were open-minded to different kinds of treatments, and naturally they look elsewhere if they're having trouble with treatments that they're already working with or want to explore things. Many said that acupuncture felt gentler or less overwhelming, and I'm quoting because we've quite literally quoted the survey respondents. So that felt less overwhelming than adding other types of medication. 30%, when asked about how they felt towards acupuncture, said that they were openly skeptical and kind of being curious about it and trying to discern for themselves where they might, be buying into different kinds of cultural things, and also trying to understand what their, perception of it was without getting it totally influenced by other people. Importantly, we don't see skepticism as rejection whatsoever. They might be open to trying it and they're curious about it, but they need a bit more evidence and understanding before really leaning in. And then 22% were unsure, and that's what they told us was that it was because they just simply didn't know enough. We've already heard tonight about how endo patients are constantly overwhelmed with a plethora of information, so it's really hard to discern. And this response, the 22% who are unsure about acupuncture, could also reflect a wider issue that we see a lot, and as many in this room know, about how young people with endo do feel quite responsible for educating themselves. Often they're not given super clear communication, or the evidence-based explanations are hard to understand, and to kind of incorporate something like acupuncture into the mix, it's a new thing for them to get their head around. So the second part I wanted to chat about was accessibility challenges. So earlier we heard a bit about kind of anthropology of these kinds of treatments and kind of perceptions around endometriosis more generally across society. But another factor I want to bring into the mix tonight is things around accessibility, and by that I mean cost. So when we're talking to young people, which is who we surveyed, 62% of them said that ongoing treatments made it somewhat or not at all accessible, and that's the challenge, of course, is because depending on how the first session goes, and depending on how quick they are hoping for results, they might not see a reason, in order to keep investing whatever significant amount it might cost, to keep coming back to acupuncture. And we understand, as we've heard earlier tonight, is that often consistency is part of the success of this kind of alternative treatment. One person said, I'd try it more if I could afford more than one session, but it's hard because you can't tell if it works after one appointment. So there's self-awareness here by these young people, that they're aware that you do need to commit, but the cost is a significant barrier. I know none of this is revolutionary, but if not, it's kind of validating as to what we might all assume young people are going through. So other barriers towards acupuncture included availability. So 35%, we have a very national membership, meaning outside of major cities, rural, regional, and so on. 35% said they did not have a practitioner nearby who specialised in women's health or pelvic pain, and especially in those regional areas. And then 40% said that the other barrier was knowledge. So they didn't know how to start, how to choose a practitioner, what qualifications to look for, and what acupuncture actually involves, or what symptoms it targets. So many voiced concerns around safety and uncertainty. So the accessibility piece that I'm bringing to this conversation isn't necessarily just financial. It's also informational, geographical, and emotional, and kind of, I guess, cultural too. So who had tried it out of who we surveyed? Out of 300, there was 44% of people that had tried it at least once, which is a significant portion, showing that young people are actively exploring complementary care, even when access isn't always the easiest thing. So among those who had tried it, about 1/3 had gone to an appointment once or twice, usually due to the cost or unclear results. Another third completed around 5 to 8 sessions of acupuncture, and they described this as the point where they could tell it would start to make a difference, so that was encouraging. And then the final third, which was around 40 people, were long-term users, attending regularly, sometimes over months or even years. And what we heard as well, kind of theme we saw from this survey response, was that many used acupuncture quite strategically, so focusing on an appointment around something like a flare-up, or at times when they're anticipating stress being triggered, or other symptoms that might flare up. So it reflects quite, I guess, a pragmatic and resourceful approach from young people, is that if they are spending the money on extra complementary treatments, they want to use it wisely, and if they can only do it ever so often, they're being quite strategic about when they use it. And then when did it actually help? Of course, we were curious about this, and the rigorousness around this, of course, is challenging. So again, I beg you to not draw conclusions from this. But what we heard from these young people was that 34% said that it had helped significantly with pain, and that these improvements weren't miraculous, but they had changed how they were managing their days, their well-being overall, sleeping, digestion, relying less on other types of treatments at times as well. 41% reported somewhat improvement, So for many, it wasn't actually necessarily about addressing the specific pain, but improving overall muscle tension, stress, anxiety, and so on, which of course indirectly shaped their pain experience. And then 25% had said that it didn't help at all, and some had described the sessions as calming or relaxing, but they just didn't see the kind of change that they were hoping for. And we don't have all the kind of background as to how these people were using it, how often they were in this case. So again, I beg you to not draw conclusions necessarily. A few quotes. It was expensive, it hurt, and I didn't feel any different. I wish I had known a bit more about what to expect. Another quote, my digestion had improved a lot, so I kept going, and then in the long run, I felt the benefits for my endo as well. So what does this, just to kind of draw us out, what does this tell us? What does this story tell us about what we asked of our community? Some themes were very strong. We heard that young people are pragmatic, they're resourceful and hopeful, they're open to trying acupuncture, not because they think it's a silver bullet or magical, but because when living with endometriosis, it does often require a lot of trial and error and an open-mindedness to trying new things, including, Western and Eastern medical practices. People are looking to reclaim control in the medical landscape, to feel educated and informed, and to try different solutions. We also saw a gap between curiosity and access, which is, I'm not asking anyone in this room to try and solve that, but I think it does reflect, a challenge more generally about how people access care in Australia for things like endo, because a lot of these, treatments are an additional cost which you don't necessarily get covered through things like healthcare, insurance and so on. And then most importantly perhaps is that success, what we saw in these responses was that success was not measured on things like pain scores alone, but many found value in acupuncture because it helped stress, anxiety, and a sense of calm or connection to their body. And for a condition that can make people feel quite powerless, these psychological benefits do matter deeply, and especially when you're in the depth of it, or you're going through a challenging flare-up or whatever you're facing. All of this can help, placebo or otherwise. And then finally, the role of support networks, which is what we hear a lot through our community, and it's why we do exist at AEF. And so this theme comes up every time we chat to our community about what their needs are, what they're facing, is that it's just as much a social condition as it is a medical one. And that often support or skepticism of people around them can really influence how they might access new and different types of care and treatment. So just kudos to you all for being here, to be open-minded, to learn about this, and to our speakers for sharing different perspectives as well. The support of friends, of partners, of parents, of everyone in their tight community really does help them feel more confident or otherwise for exploring options. And then of course those without that kind of social support and network often report to us, qualitatively, that they experience more overwhelm and more uncertainty, and they tend to report even more negative experiences overall, treatment or otherwise, with their endo because of that lack of, social support and network. And as mentioned by Amanda Lovely, is that when people believe their pain, when people hear their pain, when they feel seen, it does support them in feeling like they can access new and different types of healthcare and support. So I'm just wrapping us up. Just in closing, thanks Tammy for having us to speak tonight. I think I just want to wrap up by saying that we at AEF really are proud of the young people that advocate for themselves, that educate themselves and access new and different types of healthcare. Again, as I've mentioned earlier, we're not in the business of giving medical advice, but we are in the business of making people feel like they can support one another, share their experiences, and learn from each other amongst a patient community. We know that young people are already doing a lot of this without guidance, often without financial support, often without super accessible pathways, but their experiences reveal a very strong desire for integrative care that acknowledges complexity, different types of treatment, and lived experience. So if we all want to improve outcomes for young people with endometriosis, we often need to remind ourselves that these complementary therapies, including acupuncture, they're not fringe at all in this community. They're really well and truly part of a broader search for relief, for agency, and for a better quality of life. The more that we can understand the motivations of patients, people in our community and other patients, the better we can support them to make safe, informed and accessible choices. And that's it from me. Thank you so much.